Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of The Property Trio, the podcast for the sophisticated property buyer. I'm Dave, and today I'm your host. And as always, it wouldn't be the podcast if I didn't have Cate and Mike alongside here with me. How are you both?
Great. It's good to see you.
It's good to see you as well. So today, Cate has prepared an episode by special request from not one, but two listeners. Daniel wrote in to ask us to cover Geelong, and he formulated some great questions that we're going to unpack today. So here is his question. Hi, gang. Love the show. I'm literally listening to your latest podcast now, re Ballarat, as a viable place for investing. Cate, you suggested during the show that Geelong would be a good topic for a future episode. Thanks and keep up the good work. Then in the same week, Liam asked us the following. Keen to unpack the nuances of buying on the Bellarine Peninsula. Do you feel like this region is on the boom, and is it worthwhile? So we thought it would be great to cover both questions in a Geelong and Bellarine Peninsula ep today. So here it is. So without further ado, let's kick off with the first question with you. Can you give our listeners a quick overview of Geelong? Because not everyone is familiar with Victoria's second largest city and the 12th largest in the country, meaning it has a larger population than Hobart, Darwin, and some of the bigger regional cities such as Townsville, Toowoomba, and Cairns.
Oh, I love that. Well, I feel like a bit of a geography teacher here, but I love Geelong, so I've got a bit of information on it. Yes, it's our second largest city, and it's 75 kilometres southwest of Melbourne on Corio Bay. So they don't call it the city by the bay for nothing. With a population of close to 300,000 in 2023 in our census data collection, it's a key regional hub with a lot more on offer than many people realise. Originally inhabited by the Wadawurrung people, Geelong's name derives from Digilang, meaning tongue of land. Geelong has a beautiful and revitalised waterfront, historic architecture, and a really vibrant arts scene. Its days of being considered a blue-collar industrial city are way behind it. It's now home to many ex-Melburnians who have made the voyage around the bay. And we've got plenty of white-collar workers who now call Geelong home. In fact, that count has changed markedly over the years. And whether they have established local employment or they do the commute or they work from home, working from home definitely changed the decision-making process for a lot of Victorians and Melburnians when it came to adopting regional centres. Geelong's economic pain is memorable, though, and we do have to talk about that. The collapse of pyramid banking society hurt a lot of locals back in the 80s. I had family that were tied up in all of that, and an uncle of mine lost his home. The more recent Ford car plant closure was a significant one for the city too. And these days, Geelong is home to the Spirit of Tasmania, which relocated from the Port of Melbourne. It's got Avalon Airport close by, Deakin University, Warn Ponds and Waterfront campus. And there are several other decentralised private businesses and public services too. Now, to tie in Liam's question, it's the gateway to the Bellarine Peninsula and the Great Ocean Road. So it offers beaches, wineries, lots of natural attractions. And the recent growth has been driven by affordable housing, improved infrastructure, and a shift towards a diversified economy, making Geelong a really popular destination for new residents and visitors too.
I'm just stunned by the news that the Spirit of Tassie has moved.
Yeah.
Where was I on that one?
Yeah, the deal at the Port of Corio was way better.
Yeah, right. So you have to catch it from Geelong now,
That's
or
right.
does it just live there and it pops over to St Kilda?
No, you have to catch it from Geelong. So you jump on the Princess Highway, and it's in near North Geelong, so it's on the water, and in that Port of Corio, and they've got an amazing facility there. It's way better than what was at Port Melbourne, to be honest. And getting on and off the ferry, I speak from experience. It's all. They've done a great job, and they did it very quickly too.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I had to go on that once. I drove from Newcastle down to Melbourne Took me 10 hours. Stopped for petrol and a wee, and that was it. Just hammered it down.
I'm guessing you didn't
Good
take the
times.
kids.
Anyway, no.
No.
Pre-kids. I want to talk about the Ford plant because that was a big deal. It was in the news at the time. And if you listen to the media, it would be Geelong's going to crash. I know you were very active at the time, and a co-author friend of yours was talking up Geelong at the same time as that Ford closure. And I kind of found that very interesting, that all the stories were Geelong, you just can't touch it because such a big employer is gone. Everyone's depressed. But straight on the back of that, the market went bananas.
It
So
did.
talk us through that.
Wow. I was cautious initially as well, because you don't want to go buying into a city that is on the brink of collapse. People were very, very fearful, and the sentiment, was low. Confidence did only deteriorate marginally though, and it very quickly bounced back. In fact, Geelong's property price growth since the Ford plant closure in 2016 has been very impressive. COVID did amplify it, but we'll touch on the impact of COVID in a bit. I think Geelong was able to successfully move from being known as an industrial blue-collar working location, to all of a sudden not having that Ford plant, underpinning all of that. And it doesn't mean that it didn't hurt a lot of people. It hurt an enormous lot of people, but it was already transitioning to attract a lot more white-collar workers. It already had decentralised government services and also health services in Geelong. The TAC was there. There's a lot going on anyway that was prior to the Ford plant closure. And I think it just really enabled Geelong to transition out of that industrial town kind of mentality. And it all of a sudden, became an education centre, a health centre, and the food and wine scene, in tandem with wineries really exploding in that region and getting, global notoriety, really. I think Geelong was able to transition, and the Ford plant closure, as traumatic as it was for many people, just let it shake the shackles of being known only as an industrial place.
Yeah, I guess that's an important part of the new narrative of Geelong. But, we're talking about 600 job losses in Geelong, yet the property market, as you say, it actually outperformed expectations even with that. And how do you think it just did so well? The transition already sort of begun, and there was diversification of the economy already?
Yeah. Like I said earlier, its health and education rates are really deep, and it was attracting a lot of higher income earners from Melbourne already. I already had a lot of people saying, oh my gosh, have a look at the housing in Geelong West or East Geelong or Geelong Central or whatever the suburb. There's so many beautiful suburbs in Geelong. But the fact that it was already attracting higher income earners and people taking jobs and opportunities with places like the TAC, they got assistance with their stamp duty and with buyer's agents. I assisted some people that moved with the TAC. That was already
via us, because we were
one
of
indeed.
their preferred advisors to their staff. So we actually assisted about 100 of their 600 staff, and then we sent a number of them your way as well to assist with actually purchasing properties in Geelong.
Yeah, it was an enormous privilege and really exciting to see someone embrace a new city that hasn't necessarily chosen previously to live there, other than having that job opportunity, which was a great one. So these things in the background, Mike, were already happening, not just decentralised services attracting new people. It was already doing it in its own right, and a lot of lifestyle factors as well. And it's helpful to look at the population growth and segmentation of these new inhabitants. So between 2014 and 2024, the population increased by 61,821 people. So, a compound annual growth rate of 2.4%, which is nothing to sneeze at when you're looking at a small city. And the population is expected to reach just shy of 400,000 by 2041, according to the City of Greater Geelong. Net overseas migration is the largest contributor to the recent growth, followed by net internal migration and natural increase. The largest age group in Geelong is parents and home builders, so 35 to 49 years old. And Geelong is experiencing a surge in people moving from major cities, making it a popular sea change destination. I can speak about this. I've had people from Queensland, Sydney, obviously a lot of Melburnians. And we're also seeing a lot of people transitioning into retirement, choosing to move there. So whether it's for lifestyle reasons or to be closer to family or just to economically put yourself in a better position and, maybe cash out on the family home and put some of that into super. I'm seeing a lot of this.
Yeah, and look, that age bracket of 35 to 49 is the age bracket you want as the predominant group within your city, because obviously that's peak earning years and generally creating families, so building further on the population and the foundations of that city. So, that's a really good sign for Geelong.
It's a great sign, isn't it? And it's a very interesting segment of the population increase to look at. And it's diametrically opposite to Ballarat, which is very interesting. Bernard Salt spoke in Ballarat about the challenges that city faces. And one of them is that they lose their working age people after they educate them, and they don't return until they're looking at retiring. And I'm paraphrasing and generalising here, but their challenge is that they need what Geelong's got. They need that working cohort, that mature working cohort to want to come back to Ballarat earlier.
Yeah, it's a problem that New Zealand have, for example, the brain drain, and a lot of their most educated young people then move overseas and live and work in Australia or London, UK. And so that's a great sign for Geelong. And it's certainly supported with fresh data also from the Regional Movers Index. So here's a bit of information on that for our listeners. I was certainly surprised to read that Greater Geelong has toppled a 2-year winning streak by overtaking Queensland's Sunshine Coast to become the country's most popular destination among Australian movers, after securing regional Australia's biggest share of net internal migration. So on the latest Regional Movers Index, the report shows in the 12 months to March, the Greater Geelong local government area, the LGA, had a 9.3% share of total net internal migration, which was greater than the second largest LGA in the country, the Sunshine Coast, of 8.9%. So, we all have this sort of idea in our mind of how all these southerners move up to southeast Queensland for the warm weather and up to the Sunshine Coast in particular. But this latest data comes out and tells us that actually more people are moving to Greater Geelong than any other LGA in the country. The southern change comes amid an uptick of movement out of metropolitan areas to the regions, with capital city to regional locations increasing by almost 11% on the last quarter to sit 20.5% above the pre-COVID average, which is really interesting. And look, actually, just one other tidbit, just because Cate loves her sport, it's worth noting that the Geelong Cats, the mighty Cats who Mike supports with a passion.
I'm going to let you have this. I'm a Cats supporter.
They stand out as the only AFL club based in a regional city, aside from the Gold Coast Suns, which is more than 50% larger than Geelong. And this means a footy club has an outsized impact on the city, with their home ground full for all home games, and that has a capacity of 40,000, making it the largest stadium in an Australian regional city. It can hold basically 15% of the entire population.
It pretty much does. They're pretty into their footy.
They are. And it boasts over 90,000 members, with a third residing in the Geelong region, you'll be happy to know, Cate. So basically about 1 in 10 residents of Geelong are also football club members. That's how mad they are for their footy down there. And so these 10 to 12 home games annually, these events draw thousands of visitors to Geelong, significantly benefiting local business and tourism by boosting hospitality, retail and accommodation sectors.
I learned something about the Geelong Football Club when I was doing this prep. I'm breaking my own rule here. But they are the second oldest team in the VFL league. Like VFL and AFL, obviously, but the second.
One of the originals.
Yep, number 2.
They might have even won the first or second grand final, I think, from memory. from my old footy finals book that I had as a kid that Luke now reads, dating back to 1887 or something.
Tells a lot about
Jeez,
your
you're
family,
right, Dave.
Dave.
I didn't know you were born in the 18th century. That's yeah, wow. That just speaks to the passion, doesn't it? And I think it's important to give a little bit of context. We've been talking about Darwin a fair bit, but Geelong is double the size, and it's projected to get even bigger, and probably the population is expected to grow at a faster rate. So it's not a little regional town. It's bigger than one of our capital cities, right? 300,000 is a very big. It's a very big economy, and it's it will have diversification unless it has a massive big mine that employs everyone, which it doesn't. Cate, a fair few people from Melbourne would be part of that data set of the migration and moving there. I'm wondering about the work from home phenomenon. I was speaking to a forecaster the other day who said what people don't necessarily realise is a lot of these office complexes during COVID were on 10 or 20-year leases, or let's say they had 5-year leases mid-COVID. So there's a lot of office leases that will expire. It's a bit like those interest-only loans, or let's say the COVID loans at 2%, kind of rolling off 5 years later. We don't necessarily see the impact for a little while. I wonder if, depending on which way we go, what's the commute like? Is it sustainable for someone to work in Melbourne and live in Geelong, or is the work from home revolution going to kick a second gear and Geelong's going to be a beneficiary of it?
Well, I'm happy to answer this because I ride that road a lot. I don't think that there's an issue with commuting at all. It's a good commute. Whether it's car or train, that arterial to Geelong has improved markedly. Our Western Tunnel project is just a small part of Victoria's big build, but it's been a massive part of living in the western suburbs, and it will have an impact for Geelong, most definitely. The freeway widening on the Western Highway and Princess Highway is going to make freeway travel even easier for commuters. The rail upgrades and increased number of services are enticing for those who like to sit back in a comfortable carriage and read or work, me included. It isn't always easy to get a seat, though. Sometimes, if you have a cancelled service, you're jumping onto a very crowded train, and that's a pretty horrible ride. But a lot of Melburnians do that to the outer suburbs anyway, same travel time and standing up in a crowded carriage. The biggest threat, aside from, overcrowded trains, is just keeping up with the number of services, but they are being constantly increased. Now let's compare Geelong's distance from Melbourne to those of the distance between Sydney and some of Sydney's satellite cities, because we've all heard about Wollongong and Newcastle and the Central Coast, but we just assume, we know that they performed really well and continuing to perform in New South Wales. And a lot of people attribute that to Sydney-siders saying, look, Sydney's just too expensive, I'm going to move. Let's talk about the distance between Geelong and Melbourne compared to Sydney's distance with those cities. Sydney's off-peak commute times range from an hour and 4 minutes from the Central Coast, an hour and 20 minutes from Wollongong, and 2 hours and 12 minutes from Newcastle. Can you validate that last one, Mike?
You're talking about via car, no traffic?
Yeah.
You can probably sneak under. Well, I've snuck under 2.
Yeah, but you drive fast in a Porsche.
Sometimes it's an MCG Corolla, but still achievable. No, look, it is probably just under 2, in and around 2, but there's no train that gets you there sub 2:30 something. I think 2:37, 2:39 is the express, and if you get one that takes all the stops, it's much closer to 3 hours.
Yeah, wow, that's not a commute time that anyone would like. So interestingly,
Kate, you could even compare to some of the outskirts of Sydney. Having we talk to the back office staff at all the banks, and a lot of them are based in Sydney. And there are people, not as much as used to, but there are people who travel 2 hours from one part of Sydney to work in another part of Sydney, let alone
Blue Mountains would be that.
Yeah, the outer regions. So, it's closer and easier to get to Melbourne than a lot of, people who live and work in Sydney and travel to the CBD or somewhere nearby.
Wowzers. Okay. That definitely puts context around it, doesn't it? The Central Coast exhibits a similar travel time to Geelong and Melbourne's travel time. However, Newcastle and Wollongong both remain a serious commute by any traveller's standards. And despite Sydney's notoriously difficult peak hour traffic conditions, people there have still voted with their feet. And I make the point that Geelong is a shorter commute than both of those latter routes. And when you consider work from home, many businesses are accommodating a hybrid arrangement, even if they are calling workers back.
Yeah, look, I know our Australian staff, none of them's expected to be in the office more than 3 days a week. And our more experienced staff we allow to come in only up to 1 day a week. Personally, I'm back enjoying going into the office, so I'm sort of 3 or 4 days a week.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, look, that's a great comparison, and we all know what sort of growth New South Wales has seen in those 3 regions you just talked about. So let's circle in another one of Daniel's questions. What do you see as drivers for the economy?
Well, much like Victoria's other large regional cities, Geelong's diversity with employment is a draw card. But, travellers, whether they be day trippers, holiday house owners, Tasmanian ferry patrons, overseas visitors enjoying places like the Great Ocean Road, all of these can't be ignored. As I mentioned earlier, Geelong's home to some large healthcare and education services, and hand in hand with Ballarat, Geelong boasts some of the state's most exclusive secondary schools. So I think it's fair to say that increasing interstate migration is going to be a huge driver for the economy here. And we're anecdotally seeing some high household income buyers making that decision to call Geelong home. And I'm not making it up. To support this claim, I found an excerpt in an Access environmental planning report saying migration drives our population growth significantly. The 2023 Regional Migration Study reveals that 65% of new residents arrive from Greater Melbourne, attracting by housing affordability and lifestyle benefits.
Yeah, so do you think it's mostly affordability reasons that drive decisions to move to a place like Geelong? Or are there other factors such as you've just touched on schooling? And for example, many people may not know that Geelong Grammar is one of the most prestigious schools in Victoria, considered up there with perhaps Melbourne Grammar and Scotch College, and has produced alumni that some people may not know, including King Charles, who went there at age 17, Rupert Murdoch, John Gorton, our 19th Prime Minister, Missy Higgins, the artist, and Portia de Rossi, the actress, among many others.
Yeah.
And it also has fees to match, which in the final years of school are in excess of $50,000.
Ouch. That's amazing. Look, there are quite a few great schools in Geelong. I mean, the Geelong College is also quite renowned. Obviously, Geelong Grammar is a very serious one, on a national level. But to answer your question, Dave, and I love your list of people. Thanks for that. I think it's deeper than just affordability. That's a part of it, no doubt. But affordability goes hand in hand with value, a value proposition. It doesn't mean that you can't afford what you've got. It means that you're looking at something else saying, I think that's better value. And we're seeing a lot of that in Geelong. The schools, the lifestyle, the beaches, the employment, they're all attractive for many who make the shift. Those inner Geelong suburbs offer some really gorgeous period houses too. So if you're into your period houses and you want a little bit more land on title, for $1 million, it's conceivable to purchase a stunning period home within walking distance to the city. Now, in Melbourne, that would come at a price tag 3 times that. So, yes, in essence, affordability is a big part, but there's way more to Geelong than just cheaper housing equivalents.
So the property prices obviously soared during COVID and post the Ford plant closing, but what's happened since then? Because I guess if we're focusing back on the listener question, it's like, what are the future drivers? Are there any big sort of infrastructure projects or any highlights for the Geelong economy?
Yeah, there are. And let's talk about COVID. We can't ignore that because it saw the most rapid rise in property values that I think Geelong has seen in a short period. I remember when it was so hot that agents were closing things out and taking, 25 offers. And then they were doing online auctions, Gavel and a few other platforms and programs where they'd ask you to bid online, and it was insane. I'd never participated in an online auction with over 30 bidders. And I remember one particular property I appraised around the 1.2 and it fetched over 1.6. Clearly I wasn't the buyer, but the FOMO and that desperation to get into what's, really comparatively a small city compared to Melbourne, really stressed the Geelong market, because we had such a large number wanting to move there, whether they were renting, trying before they buy, or just deciding to live there through COVID and come back to Melbourne, or whether they were selling and buying there. The housing situation was insane. And obviously the market responded by prices just soaring. We had the Ring of Steel for a while there, so I was very fortunate in my business to have a Geelong-based buyer's agent working for me at the time, and she was run off her feet. And I was bidding through her, standing at auctions with the phone going. It was just insane. But moving on, obviously COVID is behind us now. That market did come off like Melbourne did, and it was a big change for the Geelong agents. They'd geared up for this crazy run, and then all of a sudden things are quiet. But there is more in store for Geelong. There's a great master plan for the CBD, and just focusing on the CBD alone, including the hospital precinct and the Little Mallup area where there's lots of dining and wine bars and all kinds of fun restaurants. The plan involves an enormous shift in city workers with a target of 60,000 jobs in the city locale itself. It incorporates safety, walkability, entertainment, public transport links, defined shopping, dining, water precincts, and the planning design carefully considers the increase in city-based living as well. And that's just the city. Urban sprawl is no stranger to Geelong, and there's lots of greenfields estates, and they span in every direction, particularly the west and the south. So anyone who's heard of Armstrong Creek, Mount Moriac, these areas have lots of housing estates that are being built now. So I'll put these in the show notes, but there's a lot going on in Geelong City itself, and I'll talk later about some of the areas outside Geelong that are tourism funded as well.
Yeah, so tourism also, it does enjoy funding from a state and local government point of view. Tourism Geelong and the Bellarine have a great site which goes into a fair amount of detail about the state budget and what it means for the area. Funding for tourism in Greater Geelong is primarily driven by the Geelong City Deal, which is a 10-year plan with contributions from the Australian and Victorian governments. The City of Greater Geelong and other partners totalling over $500 million. Additionally, the Victorian state budget includes funding for regional tourism boards like Tourism Greater Geelong and the Bellarine to support the visitor economy. So it certainly gets a lot of funding down that way, and there's been a lot of Labor's won a number of elections in the state and federal seats recently, so they've probably been able to work together to support the Geelong area with that kind of funding. And Richard Marles is the local federal member, who's a significant part of the Labor Party, as most of our listeners would know. But it does have the seat of Corangamite, which often was a bellwether seat, although it has been held by Labor for the last 3 elections. So I think that all plays into helping Geelong get a fair bit of support from the governments, both state and federally.
Interesting.
Well, there's a lot going on in the Paris of the South, as I've heard someone call it, I think maybe in jest. But I want to talk about the Surf Coast, because I've taken a little jaunt down there for work and dipped my toe in the water at Bells Beach just because you sort of had to. It was bloody freezing, but crystal clear. But, a lot of people are interested in that part of the country. And if we flip across to the other side, Mornington Peninsula has been one of those locations that's seen, some growth that's topped national charts over the years. What do you see about the Surf Coast? Has that got a similar attraction to the city, or is it completely different because it doesn't have the population centres?
Wow, it's a good question. You and Daniel are aligned with that one, because he asked Torquay versus Melbourne side of Geelong and which one makes a better investment if it's not the heart of Geelong. They are very different, to answer you, Mike, and I think we have to apply caution to the Surf Coast. if we're looking at it as an investment location. If you want to live there, great. It's amazing. It's a really beautiful lifestyle and so many people enjoy it. And Geelong's such a great city centre. You don't need to go to Melbourne for anything. If you live on the surf coast, Geelong will have everything you need if you need city stuff. But I think we've got to talk about the elephant in the room, and that is volatility, price volatility. And we saw, when interest rates were 2%, these areas really flew. And when interest rates went up, they came off very quickly, and mostly because a lot of people bought holiday houses there or second houses. They might have bought during COVID and thought they'd hang on to it or Airbnb it. And the holding costs got really tough when the interest rates went up. So I'm cautious about the surf coast for two reasons. The big one's volatility, and the other one is if you're aging, do you really want to be that far away from a city?
So we have one more question of Daniel's for you to answer before we turn to the Bellarine Peninsula. Do you feel Geelong moves with Melbourne as a market, or are they two separate?
They are two separate, but they seem to have a cycle that they're in sync together in at the moment. And I've watched this over the years. If I'd been a buyer's advocate for 50 years, I'd probably have much better anecdotal evidence, but I consider over 15 years, I've seen a few cycles, and Geelong has broadly mirrored Melbourne with about a 6-month delay. The exception to the rule is when the Ford plant closed. There was a wobble initially, and people were very cautious, and investors steered clear for a little bit there. But it's certainly been moving broadly in sync. We started to show signs of improvement late last year, early this year, and pretty much 4 or 5 months later, Geelong's saying the same thing, and agents are talking about that market showing some traction now as well.
Yeah. So, look, thanks, Daniel. Some really great questions there. Thanks for sending them through, and thanks, Cate, for your insights so far. Hopefully that's provided some good information for you to go on, Daniel. We now have another listener question, as I mentioned at the top of the show, from Liam. So he was keen to unpack the nuances of buying on the Bellarine Peninsula. Do you feel like this region is on the boom, and is it worthwhile? And do you want to just quickly explain the difference between the Surf Coast and the Bellarine Peninsula to some of our listeners?
Absolutely.
Geelong.
I love the Bellarine so much, and I grew up in Sorrento, so I was a Mornington Peninsula girl, but I'm pretty loyal to the Bellarine Peninsula. I spend a lot more time there these days, and I love it. The Bellarine, obviously, at the heads of Port Phillip Bay, you've got Portsea on one side and you've got Point Lonsdale on the other, and it's roughly a mile between the two. And so you get a lot of big ships going through the channel. But to get to the Bellarine Peninsula, which Point Lonsdale is at the end of, you've got to drive through Geelong. So the only way that you can get to the Bellarine in a car or in a vehicle other than a boat is to go through Geelong. And if you want to get to the Bellarine from Melbourne and you don't want to drive around the bay, you've got 2 ferries that you can choose from. So there's the Melbourne ferry, or you can go to the Mornington Peninsula and catch the car ferry from Sorrento all the way across. So yeah, it's a beautiful part of the world. There are a lot of things going on there from an entertainment and weekender and food and wine point of view. The wineries, they've got over 40 cellar doors. Some of the most beautiful vistas you'll see. There's gorgeous elevation around the Bellarine, particularly in Port Arlington. There are also lots of housing estates. They've got a nice feel. I'm not a housing estate kind of person, but some of these beachy, quieter style estates are really beautiful. So very different to Geelong, but very close to Geelong as well. It's within a roughly 25 to 40 minutes, depending on where you want to get to on the Bellarine.
Yeah, so they're essentially the townships behind Geelong that face towards the bay until you hit the point. And then when you come around the point, that's when you're sort of essentially on the towns along the surf coast for the uninitiated listeners. Because I know a lot of people sort of like Bellarine Peninsula, surf coast, it all sort of feels like the same thing. So, yeah.
I didn't answer that very well, did I? If you think of the bay like a crescent, and you've got to go from right around to the tip of the crescent through Geelong to get to the Bellarine. But if you go around to Geelong and then veer west and continue down the coast road that looks over the ocean, yeah, that's where your surf coast is.
You can skip around Geelong nowadays to get to the surf
Yeah,
coast.
the bypass is good, isn't
I do
it?
a lot. Love the surf
Oh,
coast.
that sounds wonderful. I've got to visit that. But beautiful doesn't pay the bills, Cate. There's a lot of locations in Australia that are gorgeous and pop up in the media because, seaside, affordability, but often it's retirees that are coming in that don't necessarily stimulate the local economy because they're not necessarily spending too much money, and you can have issues with youth unemployment being very, very high. So
Yeah.
let's talk numbers. What are we talking in terms of population, household incomes, and all of the things that are a little bit more important to the property market than it being pretty?
Yeah, good question. These areas are very subject to holiday mode and off-season mode. And I grew up in that, Sorrento. We had about 4 or 5 permanents in our street, and the rest were all rich holiday makers. And it's not too different on the Bellarine. So you've got 60,000 permanent people roughly that live there, and that translates to about 23,000 households. And the non-permanents, which includes holiday house owners, non-permanent residents, so people who, it's their second home but they weren't there on census night, and also campers that come down and stay at the caravan parks. It jumps up to 127,000 during peak time. So the town more than doubles, which is an enormous opportunity, but it's also an enormous drain. And you see it when you're there. Go to places like Port Arlington over the Christmas break, and it's just a hive of activity. It's lots of fun, but then it's quite dormant during winter. You've got Barwon Heads, Ocean Grove and Point Lonsdale in terms of being affluent suburbs. So when we look at household incomes, that's the order of high to, they're the highest income areas. And when we contrast that to Torquay and Anglesea on the surf coast, that is quite a surprise. And they've gave me some prop track information, and we've got some really impressive $1 million plus towns which are coastal, and they include Barwon Heads at 1.46 million, Anglesea at 1.4, Janjuk at 1.27, Point Lonsdale at 1.2, and Torquay at 1.175. So not small bickies by any means. These are really significant house prices. And it's not just restricted to people that are making the move to live down there and right size. Some of these are holiday houses, and they're very impressive.
Yeah, so look, there's some really interesting data in there, Cate. So thanks for sharing that information. It certainly doesn't surprise me, spending a lot of time down that way over the last 3 decades during holidays, that the population doubles during those peak times. It certainly gets pretty busy, but I would say not as busy as the Mornington Peninsula, which is part of the reason people head down that way. You've got more coastline, you've got more space, you've got more surf and beach options, which is part of, and it's so beautiful. So
It is.
we all know household incomes don't tell us the full picture alone, particularly given a lot of the properties in these locations, as you've touched on, are owned by wealthy people in Melbourne, and they're their second home or their holiday house retreat. But as an investment idea, we're not suggesting that buyers should race off and buy on the surf coast or Bellarine for that matter. But so, what are some of the concerns you'd have about this strategy, guys?
Yeah, sure. Look, I think if it's a holiday house, that's very different to making that sea change and saying this is where we want to call home. I mean, I'm thinking in my mind about a lovely client I had the privilege of working with many years ago, who had a soft spot for Port Arlington. And I would describe Port Arlington as an area that delivered enormous growth because it was probably seen as not as favourable at the time as places like Ocean Grove or Barwon Heads, and there's so much about it, from a geographic point of view, that I think eclipses some of these locations. But its demographic at the time was not the same as the others, but he obviously had vision. It's got fantastic elevation. And then when they decided to have the ferry from Melbourne from Docklands, go direct to Port Arlington, and it's a fast trip. You're on this thing that just jets across the water. He made the decision to live there and work in the city, and you just buy your weekly ticket and sit back on a ferry and drink a coffee, and maybe not have a coffee if it's winter and the waves are high, but you get my drift. That was a decision that he made, that it had him moving there permanently. But holiday hotspots and holidaying in a place like these, you've got to be thinking about anything that can undermine that long-term plan. So whether it's interest rate increases, unemployment rises, personal changes to your circumstances, you don't want to purchase there and go hard for a great property and then find that the market's corrected in a really volatile fashion and you're underwater.
Yeah, that's always a risk that we talk about for holiday locations, and something we spoke a fair bit about as a risk during COVID times when a lot of these markets were booming. Mike, what are some other risks for these locations?
It's hard to add much more than what Kate's
there's
put.
heaps more.
But like I sort of said before, the holiday style locations don't necessarily have inhabitants that are driving the local economy, especially if they're just there for lifestyle reasons. And I guess it depends what you're trying to get. If you're talking about investing there versus buying a holiday home, look, I think you'd have to be a fairly wealthy person to justify a holiday home there. I mean, if you have $50 million, you do whatever you like, right? But if you are a modest person, then there's quite a lot of costs that are going to be associated with that. And if you add that up in terms of 5-star hotels, that's a lot of nights you can spend at one for the same cost. And the Victorian government, as distinct from the West Australian government, has tried to get the short-term rental market onto the long-term rental market. So a lot of people target these areas for Airbnb. WA said, we'll give you 10 grand if you put your Airbnb property on the long-term market. Victoria said, we're not going to give you anything except a 7.5% tax. And, there's vacant home taxes. There's a lot of things that people really need to consider. But these economies often have a transitory workforce as well. So if you get cuts to international migration, you're not necessarily having the same people coming through working in hospitality. And I just think sometimes we have an idealistic view of a location, but the reality of that doesn't necessarily match up with what our expectations are. And I think it can be a very, very risky thing because it just doesn't have the diverse economy supporting the values of the home and the people that are employed in sectors that are expanding and growing. I think also there's the development risk as well. So like even yesterday in the Herald Sun, there was an article about a local developer in Geelong has sought approval for a 68-lot subdivision and a townhouse project. And the state's got a target of 128,000 additional homes for Geelong by 2051, which is a sizable amount of homes. I mean, having a target for hitting home building is famously ridiculous because the Labor Party did that with their 1.2 million homes in 5 years. We're nearly 2 years in and we're about 30% off. And with increases in migration, there's an argument to say that 1.2 million will just house the migrants that we have coming in. So you've got to take that with a grain of salt. But anywhere where there's the availability of land, which typically happens in these locations that don't have big populations, that's a downside risk as well.
Yeah, we've not talked about land tax, which is a nasty sting in the tail for anyone who wants a holiday home in Victoria. And I think your cost benefit analysis, Mike, around the real cost of a holiday house versus having a favourite holiday destination and paying a hotel or a motel or an Airbnb fee, that's something that everyone's got to really weigh up.
Yeah. So really, whether it's a home investment or holiday home strategy, you need to go in with your eyes wide open and make sure you understand the pros and cons before you take the plunge. But look, I think that's been a great episode, Cate. Thanks very much for providing such great information, insights and data around Geelong, the Bellarine Peninsula and the Surf Coast. And thanks so much to Liam and Daniel for your great questions. So without further ado, let's go into our gold nuggets.
Now it's time for us to go mining for our gold nugget property tip of the day.
For any investors that are looking at various capital cities and wondering which one to pick, I think it really pays to consider the population sizes of our capital cities and don't overlook the big regions, because as you've just heard about Geelong only, and there are so many good big regions around our nation, there's a lot on offer here and potentially a lot of population growth, job growth, and if that feeds into capital growth, then obviously for someone who's chasing good returns, we need to be running the ruler over all of our big cities.
I love Geelong. Love the Cats. Haven't really spent any time in Geelong. I mean, I've visited.
We'll
there,
fix that.
But, yeah, I'm not a hot spotter, but I've recently spoken to two of them. One of them talked about second wind markets, so markets that have performed well in the past, that have taken a breather, where they see a lot of upside potential. Another one gave 3 locations that were of extreme interest to them the back end of 2025, and Geelong was one of them. I think from an affordability point of view, that the market has been in decline, and if you're trying to buy something for $700,000 or $800,000 in Melbourne, in places like Frankston, for example, it's too late. Whereas I think there's an opportunity in Geelong. Cate sort of mentioned that the markets do sort of tend to connect themselves to the city in a similar way that Sydney Wollongong, Sydney Newcastle, Sydney Central Coast, Melbourne and Geelong and places like Ballarat. Melbourne tends to move first, and then you get that sort of movement. But bigger than that, I think the Geelong seems to have a very progressive vision and a progressive council. Things are really happening there. And as I mentioned before, it's double the size of Darwin. And as Cate mentioned, look, if you live in the Surf Coast, you go to Geelong, you don't need to go to Melbourne for anything. I think I once came up with this idea that if you can get Ethiopian takeaway, then the city's big enough. And we have that in Newcastle. I mean, that's the largest regional city. But I suspect that there's takeaway Ethiopian in Geelong, and that ticks all my boxes.
There you go. That is the key to hot spotting, I think.
Ethiopian takeaway.
In one sentence.
I love
it. Look, we've touched on it a little bit, but I think one of the key reasons for Geelong's success is the strategic relocation, which was led by the Bracks government and then later the Andrews government, of the major government agencies like the TAC, WorkSafe, Victoria, and then also it's the home of the NDIA, which facilitates the NDIS around the country. So their presence, and they're similar type sort of organisations, so their presence has created a thriving ecosystem of professionals in health, insurance and disability services. And that allows talent to move between these organisations, building deeper expertise and driving those stronger community outcomes. Talent moves, they share knowledge and work together. And as we sort of touched on before, Cate, we worked closely in 2009 with the TAC when all their staff, well, not all of them, but a large chunk of them relocated from Melbourne. And that was the largest government agency move in Victoria's history, which moved at that point 650 staff. And that number's now, grown to 1,200. So as we touched on, we had the privilege at Property Planning Australia and we sent a number of them to yourself, Cate, as well, who we worked closely with. There was probably around 100 of their staff to make informed decisions about whether to relocate, factoring in they had generous government incentives like $15,000 bonuses to move, 20% of salary top-ups, extra leave and stamp duty waivers. WorkSafe moved in 2018 and then the NDIA started there in 2019. And Regional Australian Institute report in 2019 found those last 2 moves added another 1,000 direct jobs, which helped drive Geelong's CBD renewal and economic diversification. So, Yeah, moves like this don't just shift buildings, they reshape cities and drive economies and push up property prices as
Oh, I
well.
love it. Can I have a second gold nugget?
Sure.
If anyone is wondering about Geelong and what it's all about, and you want to have a day trip or a weekend down there, highly recommend either the waterfront and or Little Mallet Street. Some awesome eateries there, beautiful wine. They've got an amazing botanic garden that you can wander through. The arts precinct is great. One of my favourite galleries is there, and my favourite library that I've ever been to. Newcastle's is cool, Mike, but I like Geelong's more. Well worth a visit.
You must be on Tourism Geelong's payroll.
Sounds like it, doesn't it?
Well, look, that was a whopper of an episode, and we better wrap it up there. But it's been great talking about and learning about Geelong, Bellarine Peninsula, and the Surf Coast. And thanks for all your great insights, information that you've provided, Kate.
Likewise, Dave.
Thank you too, Mike. Enjoy the rest of your week, guys.
We'll see you next time.
You too.